Hey, this is Drew and Elijah, and we're starting in here on this podcast talking about a comment that we got in a recent post. So I'm not sure if we did this before, but there's an interesting comment on your post that you just recently posted, and we wanted to give some special attention to that comment. There's some interesting stuff there that we want to delve into. So your post, maybe you can talk about your post.
Yeah. Maybe a bit of background on the post. So the post is about Pensacola Christian College canceling the King Singers over lifestyle concerns, which is one of the members is gay.
Which was interesting to you because your parents, right? Your parents went.
My parents met
to,
there. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's where they met. So I owe my existence to PCC. And I'm also a King Singers fan. Mm-hmm. Been to 2 of their concerts, I think, and own lots of their recordings type of thing. So anyway, it's an incredibly interesting topic because this is a college that has a performing arts series where they invite secular groups to come in, which I think is great. Mm-hmm. But you would think that if you're doing that, you are routinely going to be having people coming that are not following a Christian lifestyle because that's what they gave as their reason for the cancellation.
Right.
So it seems homosexuality is kind of put in its own category for warranting a cancellation. It also seems very likely that groups that they've had before would have had a gay member, and that just wasn't, people didn't find out about it, and everybody survived. And in this case,
it's almost like somehow maybe publicity got, well, they said parents had issues with it, right?
Yeah. And again, this is not like a very vocally gay group at all.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 6 singers, and 2 of them are gay.
They're not going around celebrating their gayness.
Right. You kind of, it's one of those things. I wonder if maybe one of them is, but it's not very public. And what's really interesting is the King Singers, they issued a statement after they were canceled. They said that they knew they were attending a conservative fundamentalist college, and they thought, music is a beautiful thing that can kind of work beyond boundaries type of thing. That was their way of viewing it, apparently not how the college viewed it. Mm-hmm. But then again, it kind of begs the question, then why exactly are they having a performing arts series where they're having these high-end secular groups come in to perform?
Yeah.
So anyway,
is it like a don't ask, don't tell policy?
Yeah, it kind of seems a little bit like that.
Presumably, they only did this because parents complained too, because
I think it was parents, students, and staff. But yeah,
well, it's inconceivable that no one had a problem okay, let me put it this way. It's inconceivable that no one knew about other groups or even about this group that there were gay people on it. Mm-hmm. Like someone knew who was inviting them and getting them. So the only reason why they eventually canceled them was because they got a stink about it and had to do something about it, which seems, seems like they probably only did that because it was a political touch point.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that I think is part of the issue that we're dealing with, is this really close connection between what Christians think of as morally important and what the political party that white evangelical Christians tend to go for the most, and what that party thinks about morality.
Well, and there's such an inconsistency problem with that, because evangelical Christians in America gave us Donald Trump as our president, who's an incredibly immoral person.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, it's the policy, not the person. But then, at some point, it kind of seems like, I think we have to be very careful that we don't signal that, you can be like this straight guy that, you've probably sexually abused someone, you've slept with all these different women, but, at least you aren't gay. And like when somebody's gay, then we can really get our guns out and really, it's just like so ridiculous.
Like if Donald Trump had been a monogamous gay guy, who was like pure in the sense of not being into all sorts of sexual perversions and stuff, would evangelical Christians have gone for that?
Probably not.
Probably not.
So there's something about that I think it's concerning because, and it's not at all that that I'm not concerned about homosexuality, that I don't think it's a sin.
Right.
But the way that we take something that can seem more distant, maybe, than the like overly aggressive, sexually adventurous straight male idea. Like, we need to be consistent and not think that somehow,
Yeah, and don't put out a paper that says it's Christian morality that's causing you to do this.
Right.
If it's really not Christian morality, if it's really more like political concerns.
Exactly. So anyway, that's kind of the background for this post. And let me just read this comment we got from Leon Helmuth. It says, "Thanks for sharing. Something that I have watched with curiosity is the way that these, quote, standards, upheld to make a statement, slowly erode over time to finally reach the place where the standard becomes anything about 50 years beyond modern times, rather than God's word as it is relevant today. For example, PCC may have, hypothetically speaking, banned someone for divorce 50 years ago, but today such a position would no longer be tenable for the greater professing Christian community they want to be a part of. Would be interesting to hear thoughts on how this idea may be affecting our Anabaptist communities." So
yeah, that's fascinating.
A lot of food for thought there. Where should we start, I think?
Well, a part of the question here is, I guess you could go two directions with this. One is you could say, okay, we all agree that this is inconsistent and it's a problem. Mm-hmm. But you could either say, well, you should really be consistent with every area of Christian morality, and you should say, we're not going to have anyone on campus giving a speech or talking or sharing some sort of form of art that doesn't conform to, like, this is not a Christian, doesn't conform to the gospel and to scriptural standards for morality. Or you could say we should actually allow anyone, if it's a form of art, if they're doing something well that you appreciate, even if they don't conform to Christian standards of morality in any sense, you should allow them to come just on the basis of their ability to do whatever they're good at. Mm-hmm. Those would be, I think, the two consistent positions that one could hold.
Sure.
This position of just choosing sort of one sin as the real politically incorrect sin at the time, and then tacking on Christian morality is the real reason why we're doing this, seems inappropriate and inconsistent. But there's that tension, or the two potential options there.
Right. Well, and there's those options, and then there's the option of outside of. We can think about this in the wider context of churches and relating to each other within the church, because there's a lot of issues within Christianity relating to other people where we have to decide, is this area of disagreement big enough that we should be having less fellowship, whatever. So if we're looking strictly at like this, the homosexual issue here with the King Singers, then I think it's a lot more straightforward. It's like, if we are going to be relating with secular people and feel like that's something that our organization, in this case a college, thinks is a good thing, then we need to, then I don't think trying to use some random things of biblical morality in that context. But I'm curious what you think about this, Elijah, because let's say this was 1920 and we find out that one of the King Singers is gay. How should a Christian college in that situation respond? We know for sure any Christian college in 1920, if they would have found out that, one of the members of this group is gay, how they would have felt and how they would have responded. So,
well, most colleges were overtly Christian. At the time, right? I mean, 1920s, the idea of a completely secular college was a fairly unknown thing, at least not so long before that. I'm not sure exactly where it was at in 1920.
Sure. Well, I think the point there is that even if it was a secular college, having gay people wasn't exactly looked upon favorably. So you didn't have to be a Christian organization to be weirded out by having gays as part of a singing group.
Yeah, and would that be viewed any differently from having an atheist come in and sing at the time? Because wasn't there just a little bit more of like a... If Christianity has more input in a culture, they're going to draw stricter lines than if they have less input in a culture.
Sure.
And I think Christianity had much of a stronger face at that time, and certainly earlier in American history. So doesn't that factor into this discussion?
It does, although I do think it would. It still there isn't an equivalency in 1920 between an atheist and a gay, because there are plenty of well-known atheists in 1920.
Yeah.
But even in the Western world, moving, like, if we go back a century, just the idea of, it was illegal, right? I forget the exact
I don't know what the punishments
years for that, but I know, like, in England, it definitely would have been illegal in
punishable by
imprisonment, maybe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, at least this is society. This is not the church. So, and I think...
So basically, you wouldn't know that there was a gay person on there.
Right, they wouldn't be. It would be hidden. They would not be telling anybody. And if some people would find out, they could go to jail. So maybe that's a slightly bad example. But I mean, I do think that Some of these questions are different. If there's something that by society at large, if your society is Christianized enough that there are Christian standards of morality that are viewed and held by most of society, it might not. I don't think that something in a church context should be like, oh no, but here we allow these people to come. So, what do you think?
Yeah, the situation does look a lot different.
Yeah,
in that sort of a setting.
So does that mean that we are? So if
we're dealing with a different environment today.
So there is some sense of adaptability that we are showing, and so I think the question is how can we be flexible and change in some way without feeling like we're being arbitrary in how we relate to biblical standards? Because I think that's a very, very real objection here.
Yeah, and it's a sticky thing having a Christian university that doesn't require students themselves to be Christian. And maybe, I think some would, certainly many do. But also there's plenty of colleges that don't ask you to sign a born again statement to come. So it's an odd landscape because you have this school that's in an environment of a secular culture. You don't really have, if you want to be a sort of open institution, you don't have the option to at the college itself, you can certainly enforce certain standards of morality and stuff.
Sure.
But it does look a lot different from if everyone comes to the college with sort of the same framework from society of this is what a decent person does, this is what an indecent person does, and you don't want to cross those lines.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So it is a stickier landscape for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's, again, the fact that Christian colleges today have adopted more of a political framework, it's easier to tell whether a college is politically conservative or not, I think, in a lot of cases, than it is even to tell whether or not they're biblically, whether or not they have a biblical foundation for their worldview. Or at least it's hard to tell which is which.
Right. Mm-hmm. Which is concerning. Yeah.
Yeah, and of course that makes it so whatever's politicized on the right is automatically politicized within the Christian environment there. And Christian morality just gets tacked onto that. So like the real reason why we're doing this or that is because it's, quote, biblical standards or Christian norms.
Yeah. When
really the only reason why they care about that is because you're going to get flack, you're going to lose support, whatever the case may be.
Right.
But part of Leon's question here was about how does this apply to the church?
Right.
Which I think is interesting because now you're crossing a line talking about how a Christian university should react to a secular world in that gray zone of trying to figure out what is the best way to deal with wanting to interact with the rest of the world. Like really good singers, you want to interact with that world and not limit your students only to Christian singers.
Sure.
So you want to interact with that world to some level, but it's not entirely clear where the line should be drawn and things like that. Moving from that arena to the church, where you actually really do care that within the church, biblical morality is upheld because that's what it means to be a Christian, is to know Jesus's sacrifice for us and be forgiven and then walk in that freedom and forgiveness.
Right.
And that means you're going to follow Jesus in all areas of life. So within the church, it's just an entirely different framework and understanding. So somehow, as we kind of gear into this question of within our Anabaptist churches, looking at some similar questions, it is a very different framework as we talk about that.
It's definitely different. Yeah. Well, and most of the issues that are hot button within the Anabaptist context are issues that are within the church. So it's not questions of simply relating to outsiders.
Yep.
And I think that's where some of this. Yeah. Well, I think I think I might have said something about this when I commented in response to Leon there. But we can kind of have this idea that we can gauge how serious our position is on something by how stringent our lines are in relating to people who disagree with us.
Why do you think that is? It's very common.
Yeah. I don't know. It's kind of this. We want to feel like our beliefs are something that we're willing to defend, mm-hmm. and one of the ways it can most give us a sense of seriousness with that is to draw some boundary lines and exclude others. I don't know. Do you have a theory?
I think that's probably it.
I mean, I think it is kind of human nature. Like, this is not an Anabaptist or even a Christian issue. This is just like a human issue, I think.
Yeah, and absent any sort of violence, which might be like if you really believe in a certain political theory or something,
right.
You're going to start with really excising people from your circles who disagree, so you can feel this idea of purity, right?
Right.
And then, you're going to resort to violence at some point to make sure that to show that you really, like, I'll give my life for this. Within Christian circles, of course, you don't have that. But what you do have is you have excommunication.
Right.
You have the ability to say, well, at least in my church, we don't fellowship with this group. Mm-hmm. They're outside the norms of what we're willing to interact with. And that somehow that feels, I think, like a certain sacrifice maybe, or at least a certain stance that feels like, okay, now I know I really care about this.
Yeah. Well, and we see this playing out outside the church very much in today with today's culture wars. Mm-hmm. This happens very much on both the left and the right, where you see, well, cancel culture definitely comes into play here. Where
on the right and the left.
Yes. This is cancel culture on the right, this whole PCC deal.
Yeah.
But where we see this, it's almost like we know this is such a threat that we need to really take action and rule out people from polite conversation that disagree with us. I think it's really an intellectually shallow thing to do, but it's so kind of centered to human nature.
Yeah.
And so we're going to see it not only, even as we sit, and I mean, of course, I don't need to tell people listening to this podcast that council culture on the left is really ridiculous and goes too far and all of that. Yeah. But then again, like, don't we see the same tendency to do a bit of the same thing within our belief structure?
Yeah. So, but now let's talk about what the difference between excommunicating someone from the church on the basis of sin,
sure,
versus trying to create a certain sense of purity within beliefs that really are secondary. They're not salvation issues. We might say, oh yeah, they're Christians, but still I'm going to draw my lines where I want to maintain my own purity in terms of beliefs. So I'm going to make a really tight boundary around people I'm willing to really interact with. What's the difference between those two positions? And what's the difference between what Christians do, maybe the positive biblical lines that Christians will draw, and the lines that political culture might draw in cancel culture and in the kind of striving for belief purity within broader culture?
Yeah. Well, obviously there needs to be a difference between how we draw those lines in the church and without the church. And I think that's something that's often not nearly as clear as it should be.
Yeah.
And we do need to draw lines within the church. And we could have a whole series of podcasts on this topic, but like, it's entirely possible to biblically think that there's a principle we want to follow without feeling that people that do not see that thing the same way that we do
should be banned.
Right. It shouldn't be taking part of church life. What needs to be said is that there absolutely are issues biblically that we can die on. Mm-hmm. Someone comes to our church and they say, well, I'm really into pretty much everything you believe, but I don't actually think Jesus rose from the dead. It's like, sorry, that is a deal breaker. That's
absolutely
out. Or I don't think Jesus is the Son of God, or I think there are more ways to God, or
having a wrong belief on salvation, like works-based salvation. Things like that are really important to get right.
Right. And I think this is where there's this tension. And again, it's such a complicated, wide topic, but with specific beliefs that we have in the Anabaptist context that we think are not only things that we have just, we've just chosen to do it this way, but no, we think the Bible is actually teaching these concepts. Mm-hmm. But not everyone sees this the same. Mm-hmm. And how then are we going to relate working with people who are, who don't see things the same as we do on those things? So I have a few things that I think are helpful.
So let's throw out an example just so you can sort of run with this. How we relate to sports.
Sure.
So a lot of people in our circles will feel, or a certain number of people within our circles will feel like it's totally fine to go to an occasional game, to keep up on all the stats on basketball and football and baseball, and maybe have some team like, what's the word, like team paraphernalia or whatever, that with the team logos and stuff.
Sure.
And feel some sort of affinity with a particular team. All those things might be considered okay, while other people feel like absolutely not. That is a form of idolatry, and we're going to stay away from that. And I think that's scriptural, they will say, because it's idolatry when people scream at the top of their lungs at a football game. I don't know.
Sure.
So let's
not hypothetical at all.
No.
I'm trying to think how I can think about that issue itself without actually giving a strong opinion on the issue. Well, first I will say this. Trying to think how to say this in a way that conveys enough nuance.
Are you trying to say that you don't care about sports at all? Because that's also true.
Right, almost anyway. Well, let's think about it this way. Let's say we're going. This is not hypothetical. We're going to a church where we're fellowshipping with people that more or less share pretty similar views of the Christian life and some very specific doctrines. And some people feel, you need to completely stay away from anything related to the Super Bowl. If you see, if you're scrolling down through your news feed and you see something about the score from the game, you should bounce your eyes or something. So you have maybe that kind of a position, and other people that hey, we're gonna have people over and we're gonna have
watch the Super Bowl,
pizza, and we're gonna watch the Super Bowl. Again, not hypothetical. This is something that there's division on in our churches. I feel like people need to be able to have a concern about the Super Bowl, and say, hey, are we sure? Do we want our young people spending all of their time, watching the Super Bowl? I remember as someone that, I'm indifferent more or less on this issue. I'll just say that I don't really have a strong opinion one way or the other. I am not a sports freak though. But it was just simply annoying for me sometimes with my youth group where we'd be trying to do something as a youth group and have to I was oh no, it's your turn. Oh yeah, that's right. I'm watching the game. Oh, did you see? I'm just guys, we're hanging out as a youth group. Can we put our phones away and play? And of course, in a friendly way, we had some. I remember there were some of events. This is back when I was with the Crosskeys youth, where there would be a no phone event around the time of a game, and then you have to leave your phone when you come in, which is great. But again, the tendency, I think, so again, you're going to church with people. These are people that you think are Christians, and to be you're worshiping. This is an idol. It's maybe we should tone down our rhetoric a little bit. You can think that this is an unhelpful thing and something that is detrimental to the youth without going so far in your rhetoric.
So being more balanced is a part of it.
We need to be able to think that, Super Bowl and football watching can be very distracting and unhelpful in our church. Without also thinking, people that do that might literally be worshiping a false god. It's let's be careful with that.
Yeah, and also it does not mean that you believe your belief less if you don't separate yourself from other people who tend to disagree with you on that. That's one thing we just need to make really clear.
In an odd way, I actually think it means that you believe it less because you have to add this extra stuff.
You believe it less if you have to separate yourself.
Are you not actually sure that you think that? Why are you loading your rhetoric so much? I think that's where it sends this message, and it's overblown. So someone that is a Christian that maybe, if you sit down and say, hey, bro, do you really want to spend 5 hours a week watching the game and getting into your betting and whatever they're doing? You really think that's a good use of your time? But if it's just you're worshiping a false god, they're they
don't take you seriously.
Okay, now, you actually think that? So I think, it's...
Here's something I think might be a problem, and that is when you have arbitrary lines. Actually, this is something I think Leon talks about a little bit in his comment. If your lines are arbitrary, then you can't convince people of your line. Mm-hmm. And if you can't convince people of your line, the only way to maintain it is to essentially excommunicate, not necessarily actually do it, but essentially excommunicate yourself from everyone else who disagrees with you on this topic so that you can arbitrarily hold this. Mm-hmm. You can't actually pick up the Bible and convince someone that your way is right because it's arbitrary.
Sure.
And so I think that's also a problem. If you're drawing arbitrary lines that you really shouldn't be drawing for others. Now, you can draw arbitrary lines all you want on your own because you might feel like, okay, for me personally, this is probably a good move for me to make next because it really was an idol for me. Mm-hmm. That's totally fine, but you can't convince someone else that necessarily that it is an idol for them.
Sure.
And so if you're drawing these arbitrary lines where if you own a sports cap, so if you own some sort of sportswear shoes or something that has the logo of someone else on it or of a team, you are automatically worshiping another god, and you need to that you're not going to be able to convince people of that. And yeah, and as you were saying, it's almost like you don't actually take your belief as seriously as you should, because like you want your beliefs to be something that you can maintain from Scripture, and therefore you don't need to arbitrarily put yourself in a certain category and exclude everyone else in order to maintain that idea. You can convince others if in fact it is true.
Right.
Many times. It's not like you always can convince other people of your beliefs, but
sadly, actually, maybe that's a good thing because then, there would be fallout in other directions with that. Mm-hmm. I think in our churches, there can be this very much a false choice between people that have these strong arbitrary standards and then more of this anything goes type mentality. Mm-hmm. Where it's like, where are conservatives, people who hold conservative positions on things, who are able to be reasonable, not make their case too strongly, and yet care about some of these things? And I think that's where, I feel like I have so much frustration at so many times the lack of that, because it really does often seem, as I think of young people looking at the Anabaptist landscape, there's an awful sense sometimes that you can either just agree to go by a bunch of arbitrary standards and be conservative, or you can be a little more open-minded and think through things, and then, well, we all know you're going to end up not being conservative.
Yeah.
And again, I think this might terrify some people, but if that's really where things are on an issue, then people need to liberalize.
Yep. Yeah. So
that's a crazy thing to say, but I think the simple truth of the matter is, if these are positions that you can't hold in a nuanced way, where you're open to dialogue and where you don't try to draw the line unnecessarily strictly, then what exactly is there that?
In other words, if there's not the room for people to actually think about a topic, and you just either you go along with it or you liberalize,
right?
Something's clearly wrong with something.
Right, especially given that these are applications in many cases that you're not going to get something. Okay, to go back to the Super Bowl example. I do think you can argue from Scripture indirectly that, someone that's all wrapped up in the Super Bowl and missing their quiet time, obviously, once we get into that kind of thing, is, needs some help.
Yeah.
But it's not like Paul says, anyone that attends a sporting event or watches a sporting event, well, I guess watching, same thing back then, is accursed or something. Like if we had a verse that said that, and people are just saying, well, that was just for the Corinthians.
That doesn't apply. Now we're talking about a different thing.
Yeah, but it's just you do kind of have to indirectly extrapolate some things there, which I think we need to do.
Yeah,
and I think,
but we need to make it pretty clear when we've crossed over the line of making extrapolations about what a biblical text says and just saying the biblical text, saying, look, we kind of need to be honest. Like with the veiling thing, like it's totally fine to say, here's the interpretation that we think is correct of 1 Corinthians 11. We kind of think it's important, and we need to have a conversation about this if you want to be in our church but don't want to practice the veiling.
Right.
It's a very different thing to say, we believe in the veiling, and it has to cover all the hair, and it has to be black or white. and it it has to be a certain length, whatever. Like once you start making those applications, they're fine. You could do that all day if you want, but you need to make it pretty clear when you've crossed over that line. Otherwise, you're making nonsense of your positions, and you actually muddle the waters of what really is important. If everything is sort of equally, all your arbitrary lines are kind of equally important.
Well, and then this whole, people in defending conservative tradition will say things like, can't throw out the baby with the bathwater, which is true actually. But the problem is by being too stringent on those things that are more indirectly extrapolated, or maybe even just simply how we've chosen to apply it in a way that we wouldn't think was the only biblical way to do it, then you kind of are asking for people to connect those things too closely.
You've already blended.
And then once you realize, wait, this is kind of arbitrary. This, the covering needs to cover all the hair up to this point or whatever. And you're like, where did they come up with that? Does the Bible say that? No. So I guess I won't wear the head covering. I think we actually open the door up to that.
Yeah. If you pre-blended the baby with the bathwater, it's going to all get thrown out.
Right. Exactly.
I don't know what that meant.
Yeah. That's a very disturbing image. But anyway. Right. But I think this is what's so tricky. And I think back to, a lot of my wrestling through these issues, because as you well know, I have spent most of my 20s, I'm 28 now, more worried about people who are liberalizing than people who are being too conservative. There comes a point where we need to be able to make certain practical applications that we're going to carry out. And just saying kind of, well, as long as we believe the gospel, as long as we think, Jesus rose from the dead, and, we believe in the coming of the Holy Spirit, we believe in, salvation through faith, those types of things.
There is more that we need to care about.
Right. It's kind of, I think my take on that has always been if you care about those things, but it doesn't do anything outside of the abstract principle that you say you believe in, then what's your faith?
Yeah.
And I think that is something that, to give Anabaptists credit, they often are quicker to be hey, but sometimes I feel like way too often it's no, we actually take our faith seriously, which is why we only wear black socks or something like that. And it's that's where it gets to be a little bit disappointing.
Yeah. But again, the big thing that you need to make sure you're doing, if you have lots of arbitrary lines, is you need to make it clear the distinction between the arbitrary lines you draw and the big picture principles that you really care that must stay in place.
Well, I think there's a place where we need to acknowledge, and this is very much going to affect how we relate to people, both in our churches and the Christian community outside of our churches, that yes, we actually do need to flesh out our Christianity in some practical ways, which will mean that we make some very practical decisions on how we're going to apply some things. And that we recognize that the Christian faith needs to intersect with our daily practice in that way without thinking that all the ways in which it does that need to be universally applied.
Yeah.
But maybe it is important that you have chosen to apply some things in a certain way. And yes, I know there are certain specifics that Anabaptists can get hung up on that are not important that we could talk about. But I don't really think that's the point here. I think the point is we need to acknowledge we are going to flesh things out practically, often in ways that others aren't, that are not a matter of one way being more biblical than another. And there are other ways we are going to flesh out that are more biblical, but should not cause us to then pull back from others who have not applied something as
being able
biblically.
To categorize our beliefs and make that separation between the arbitrary lines that we draw and the principles that we care about.
Right.
Opens the way for being able to really fellowship across a broad variety of churches. And it also gives the opportunity to say to someone outside of our Anabaptist circles, we are open to getting some of the positive things that you teach that we feel like you're strong on.
Right.
I'm not necessarily talking about whether or not you have them in your pulpit, but whether or not you have that sort of influence, whether or not you're okay with that. And if you can't make that distinction, you're left with this incredibly broad subsection of the people that you already agree are part of the Christian church, but don't disagree with you. You're left with this little, you already agree all these other churches are apart. You're left with this tiny subset of people that you agree with completely on all these arbitrary lines.
Right.
And you're so much poorer for it.
Exactly.
So that needs to be addressed and talked about. So back to Leon's question, with these arbitrary lines that seem like they're 50 years behind schedule, and setting these sorts of arbitrary lines. One of the reasons why this happens is because people are afraid of the slippery slope, afraid that, we give in one little area, we're down in the depths of the sea of liberalism. And part of that is this self-fulfilling prophecy that comes from people who believe that all your beliefs are on a level plane. All your beliefs and principles and arbitrary standards and everything all sort of matter equally, rather than making some distinction between the clear biblical principles that you care about and the gospel underneath that. And then up here somewhere, or down here somewhere, maybe works better. The arbitrary lines that you draw because you don't want to liberalize or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. But I think too, if we, back to the whole thing about lines, if we're less about make sure we don't stray outside of this arbitrary line, even where we do have to draw some arbitrary lines, at the very least we have to draw them individually.
Yeah.
For sure. Yeah. And very likely need to do some of that within church. But if ever within a church context or an individual context, our focus becomes the lines rather than what the thing is in the center that we're pursuing, then we know we're going to be in trouble. And I think that's where
people as soon as people let go of your arbitrary standards, they'll let go of the principle too,
right?
Because they believe it's all kind of the same package.
So even if it's true that we do need to have some sense of lines as we pursue the center, the center needs to be what we're really all about.
Yeah, and so you see people who, like, let's say grew up in a church where movies were not allowed, and they're like, well, that's silly. There's some perfectly decent movies that one could watch that can help you out in some way, can give you a broader perspective or whatever. So but then the fact that their church has this like really strict standard that's also arbitrary from Scripture, not directly in Scripture, they would be a lot more likely, if those lines aren't really clear between what's arbitrary and what's not, to, when they decide, what, those arbitrary lines are silly, to just be a entertainment guru and all that they do now is watch movies. And that's silly. If they would have been taught how to separate between the arbitrary lines that one might draw and the sort of underlying convictions and things they care about, they wouldn't have to throw everything out.
Right. Yeah. Fascinating.
Well, is that enough for this discussion today?
I think we've said enough.
Very interesting question. Thanks, Leon, for the tip there. I guess we'll see you next time.